Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming in. My name is Myron Frans, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. I'd like to just go over a little bit some of the halfway offer that Governor Dayton made yesterday. But I'd first of all like to start off talking a little bit about what does a halfway offer really mean. And it's more than just numbers. Obviously, it's a fiscal and a financial position, but it's also a recognition that we as a legislature and an executive have to come together to fund state government from Minnesota. And that means all of the bill areas, all 10 bill areas, and the bonding bill are all of our responsibilities. But what we tried to do with what the Governor Dayton did last night with the halfway offer was to offer a way to end the session in a way that would provide a pathway for the legislature and the governor to fund their priorities. Clearly, we all have a responsibility to fund all different bill areas, but we also have priorities that we've talked about during the session. And as you know, the legislature's talked a lot about taxes and transportation as our two primary areas of priority. And the governor also is concerned about transportation. In fact, offered a transportation funding package earlier on in January and also offered a tax bill in the first week of January. So clearly he also believes that these areas are areas that we need to take care of, but he also firmly believes that we need to fund government in a way that provides opportunities and provides health care, provides assistance for those in direct care and treatment, for example, at Health and Human Services, provides public safety in the courts and in the corrections. So there are a lot of values based in this halfway offer that the governor made last night. Most of you have a copy of the halfway offer that the governor made last night. So what I'll do is I'll go through briefly to orient you to that spreadsheet and then talk a little bit about some of the numbers, but then I'll open it up for questions. The first thing I want to point out on the Meet Halfway Global offer that was dated yesterday at 6:40 was the first column on the left, the 516 governor offer. That was the offer that we made, the governor's office made on Monday, or was it Tuesday? Tuesday. What day is today? Thursday. My goodness, what a week. So we made that offer on Tuesday, May 16th. And you can see that column, we made the offer. And on the far right, you can see the counter offer made by the legislature that same day on Tuesday. But what I want to talk about today is the column in the middle called the meeting halfway. That was offered by the governor last night, as I mentioned, at 6:40. So if you look at the top number, I just want to go through the top really quick to make sure we know what numbers we're talking about, because now, after talking about the values, I want to talk about the fiscal responsibility that we have to have a budget that is balanced and we can afford going forward. So if you see, we all know that we began with a beginning balance of $1.65 billion. That was what we had after the forecast in February. And of that forecast amount of $1.65 billion, we have already seen some spending has occurred. The legislature passed a reinsurance bill that spent about $142 million out of that $148 million, and they also spent about $400 million out of the Health Care Access Fund to provide for reinsurance for health insurance plans. So we now all agree that the available balance is $1.502 billion. Now you can see that on this chart we put three areas up above, and that is the courts, cybersecurity, and always at M&B we always leave a little bit on the bottom line. But on the courts, the governor put the courts on top of this chart because he felt like as a separate branch of government, it is a responsibility of both the legislature and the executive to fund the courts in a way that provide for public safety, provide for the courts in terms of public defenders and the court system that's really overworked in many areas of our state. So this is a funding recommendation he's following by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That's the $83 million number. The cybersecurity number is a $45 million number. This isn't the full ask that the governor made of cybersecurity. This is for the cybersecurity and statewide financial system that the governor feels are the first two important steps we must take going forward in order to provide protection of public data, private data that we have. You know, the events of the last week or so, we all realize how difficult it is to protect the data and how all systems are under attack virtually all the time. So the governor believed that these two responsibilities, the courts and the cybersecurity, are really shared responsibilities by both the legislature and the governor to fully fund. Clearly, if the legislature decides not to fully fund these, they can make their their counteroffer in this area, but we felt it was important to put those on top of the line. And as I mentioned, we left $10 million on the bottom line. So you get to the remaining balance of $1.364 billion. And that is the available balance that we felt that the governor wanted to provide an opportunity to meet halfway on. So that is the number he divided by 50%. He gave the legislature $682 million to spend for taxes and transportation. They're split evenly, but that was just a division by 2. And in the other areas, all the other 8 bill areas, we provided $682 million to fund those areas. Once again, this was an opportunity we felt to provide a pathway for the legislature to really prioritize their areas and come up with a plan to spend that $682 in a tax bill and in a transportation bill. You know, the governor, as I mentioned, has been in favor of transportation this entire session. He had some other ways to fund that transportation. The legislature has decided to take off tab fees, for example, is not being under consideration. But remember, funding transportation is not typically a general fund item. We don't normally use general fund to fund transportation because we need long-term commitment. The governor made a major concession in agreeing to allow general fund dollars to be spent on transportation this session. And so I think it's critical that we recognize that this is an out of the ordinary situation for transportation. It's a major concession by the governor. So if you look at the bottom half of that chart, the $682 million, you see the governor's offer on the left, the legislature offer on the right, and generally, in most cases, the meeting halfway number is pretty much in the is a midpoint, not always exactly. For example, in health and human services, we are still negotiating over that particular area. We feel like we've made some major concessions, and we also are recommending that we use $350 million in healthcare access fund. That's what makes the number a minus 276. If you didn't have the $350 million from the healthcare access fund, it would be a net plus spending of $73 million to the general fund. So if you add up those two columns, and both sides are giving, we think, about the same in terms of conceding to get to this $682 million number. We believe it provides, once again, a pathway to agree on how to spend money in our priority areas. And we want to really provide something down below in these boxes because the governor, in these items down below, these 8 bill areas, these are the areas where he's really focused on, are we providing enough for the education, for the University of Minnesota system, the Minnesota state system, the grant program to allow people to attend college, the public safety area, the corrections area, state government. These are the areas in the veterans' homes that he believes we really must fund at a minimum level to make sure those services are what Minnesotans are wanting and what they deserve. You know, the other area that I'll turn it over to Commissioner Bauerly in just a second, the other area that we've had some differences is in the tax bill. And so I think the governor last night made it very clear when he was talking about his priorities are really to make sure that we fund government, we take care of people, and we make sure that the resources we have are divided fairly and equitably among all the different people in Minnesota. So I'll turn it over to Commissioner Bauerly.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. You have a chart that identifies some of the benefits for House File 4. House File 4 is the tax bill out of the Conference Committee report. And as Commissioner Frans indicated, you know, the governor released a tax bill early in session, the first week of January, so he does understand that and agrees that tax cuts are important. The priorities are really where we differ with the approach that's been taken by the legislature. So of this, as you can see, of this bill, about 3% goes to the wealthy business and special interests, and that grows, of course, in the tails. Always in taxes there are tails that grow, but particularly in 2 areas. One, the property tax reduction for businesses. That will grow significantly over time. In fact, will cost the state about $1.7 billion over 10 years by eliminating the levy inflator that is on that business property tax. And will cost the state $1.1 billion in this biennium and $1.4 in the second biennium. The blue boxes you see on your chart, just for context, that was a provision that was actually contained in the Senate tax bill, and that was a rate cut that would have affected almost 2 million Minnesotans. But when we compare that to what actually wound up in the conference report for House File 4, you'll see that that one actually didn't make it into the conference report, and instead really focuses on those who are already doing very well in Minnesota. And it's important when we think about this cost of the tax bill, not only in terms of long-term budget stability, but also relative to what does it cost Minnesotans in terms of not having enough resources for our education system, not having enough resources for our higher ed system, for the essential services of public safety that are provided across the state, through our, whether it's through our courts or through our correction system, and making sure that we have and can maintain the high quality of life we have here in Minnesota. So we just think it's, the governor, as he indicated last night, this offer was an attempt to bridge the gap and really try to move us forward. And by focusing on providing half of the remaining surplus for taxes and transportation. Of course, when you're going to take general fund for transportation, that's going to necessarily reduce the amount you can spend in other areas. This divides it up in ways that represent each party's priorities, and we just want to make sure that we have enough to fund what makes Minnesota great. So I think we'll open it up for questions. And sorry.
Let me just finish by talking about the financial management piece of this. And I've talked to a lot of you over the last several months about our concern about the forecast going forward. We have a lot of variables out there at the federal level in terms of spending and what's going to happen either with taxes or infrastructure. We have variables out there on the economy. As most of you noticed, we had a downturn in our revenue our revenue receipts in April. So there are a lot of issues out there that we're concerned about. So I think that's why it's really critical that in addition to the values that we bring to this budget and how we decide this budget based on our values, we really bring to this budget fiscal responsibility to make sure that it's funded not only in this particular biennium, but in the future biennium as well. So we're open for questions.
Commissioner, talk to us a bit about the use of the Healthcare Access Fund, which is not fully reflected on this sheet, but does prop up health and human services. With that fund losing its revenue source in current law, how is that sustainable spending?
Well, we recommended that the provider tax be extended. So this is another area, just like the tab fees that we suggested in the transportation area. We suggested that the one way to help finance the transportation was to provide for an increase in tab fees, and the legislature rejected that. We provided for extending the provider tax at the end of 2019, which would add $1 billion just by doing that alone for the out years here in the Healthcare Access Fund. So once again, by taking that provider tax extension off the table, it does cause the use of the Healthcare Access Fund to run near at the balance at the end of 20 and 21, but it doesn't provide funds going forward. So it's something we're going to have to address going forward. But we would suggest that we would extend the provider tax to make sure that there's additional funds in the Healthcare Access Fund.
Why do you call this a meet halfway offer when you take out courts and cybersecurity and you include the Healthcare Access Fund, that $450 million that the governor agreed to in January? Why is this halfway?
Well, first of all, the governor didn't sign the bill. He allowed the bill to become law. It was a legislative proposal to fund $540 million into insurance plans for the reinsurance market. And whether it works or not, we'll see. But he had another plan. His other plan was to provide assessments that would partially fund that reinsurance market. So clearly it was a decision to use $400 million from the Healthcare Access Fund. And we're proposing using $350 million at this time. So that sounds pretty even to me. The rest of the surplus, the 50 idea or halfway here really is taking what's available, what's left over, 1.364 million, and dividing that and meeting halfway.
I think part of what Pat was getting at too is why separate out courts, cybersecurity, and the bottom line and not have them grouped in with the other spending down below? Why is that treated differently?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the judiciary is a separate branch of government. The governor feels very strongly that it's a joint responsibility by the legislature and the governor to fund that. And also the same thing with cybersecurity. If the legislature doesn't want to agree with that, then they can certainly take that off in their counter offer. The other thing we could have done that we didn't do, there are a number of ways to get to halfway here. We could have taken all the items on the right side we agree with. Let's say, for example, we all agree that the education is a minimum of 1.5% or 1.5%. We recommend 2% on the formula. But if we agreed that we, at a minimum, had 1.5%, that's $277 million. Why don't we put that on the top? Because that's a joint enterprise. The idea here was to provide an opportunity for the legislature to fund their priorities, taxes and transportation, and for us to provide the funding for the rest of the bill areas in a way that was an equal distribution of funds.
But again, you decide what is in and what's out of this halfway.
It's an offer. It's like any offer, and if the other side wants to come up with a different offer, they're certainly entitled to.
When I look at your halfway offer and what GOP came with, again, last night as their counter offer, and I do the math, and I remind myself there's a reason why I'm not an engineer, and most of us on this side of the table, but when you add up the math, I mean, you're talking about a difference on taxes and transportation of $515 million, on everything else, $405 million, and that's almost $1 billion difference, $920 million. I mean, is there any wiggle room here? I mean, is there any way that you can surmount that here in the next 2 days?
It's going to be difficult. It's a good question. It's going to be difficult. I mean, for example, look at HHS. The governor made a proposal to spend a little over $300 million in additional funds beyond the base in his budget. And we've brought that down to almost, I think it's $73 million above the spending base now, based on changes we've made, cuts that we've made, savings that we've found. And yet the legislatures, they originally were proposing in the House side a $600 million cut to HHS. Well, that's $1 billion difference practically right there. So a large part of our difference is in the HHS area. And part of the difficulty is the proposals that we've brought forward in HHS and we've talked to the legislature about have involved ways to save money, ways to reduce spending, and some of the proposals by the legislature have really been to shift costs to the future, shift costs to the counties, shift costs to providers or to the forecast. And by doing that, yes, we can balance the budget by shifting the cost off to other people and off in the future, but in another year or so, that's all going to catch up with us, and we're going to have to actually cut people off programs when we have to pay those costs that have been delayed, because they will come back. So I think the key is we've got to come to an agreement on HHS where we can provide funding for those programs, and if the legislature wants to cut programs, they need to tell us what programs do they want to take away from people that are available now, and we haven't seen that kind of specificity.
On the business property tax breaks, have you done any analysis to show us how many of those are mom and pop stores that maybe have one property versus larger companies that have multiple properties? And because I understand the exemption is per property, not per company, correct?
So there are two pieces to the business property tax reduction. One is the exemption, and that would affect all companies and would allow them to not pay tax on a certain amount of their property. And that number has been changing over the course of the session. And then there's the reduction in the levy inflator. And when the levy was set in 2002, part of the deal when that was put into place was that it would go up every year. And it's important to recognize that all of our property taxes have gone up every year. And in Minnesota, residential property taxes have gone up about 100% since 2002. And this business property tax has gone up about 60% since 2002. And so there are two pieces of it. The piece where you can exclude the first portion of your property from tax will affect all businesses and certainly will help smaller businesses more. The fixing of the levy, freezing of that levy will ultimately affect large businesses, large landholders more.
Commissioner Frans, earlier you said something to the effect of when Republicans counter this offer, they countered that offer last night. Is the governor viewing this as his last best offer, or are you preparing a counter of your own?
Well, last night, Governor Dayton presented his meet halfway offer, and he believed that the offer we received last night was not that way. He really went to the 50-yard line, and we're waiting for the House, or the legislature to come to the 50-yard line. So we're at an impasse. I'm not saying we're not going to do anything differently in the future. Right now, though, we made an offer to meet halfway, and we haven't been met halfway, and so that's why we're at an impasse right now.
Republicans say that the ball is in the governor's court to continue the sports metaphor. So if you're saying it's in their court, they say it's in your court, how do you end up being in the same court?
That was what I call an impasse. Governor made a meet the halfway offer, they haven't, and that's where we stand.
Is the administration going to do something to stop this impasse?
We're doing something all the time. We're talking to our counterparts in the legislature all the time, and there are discussions going on, but we're waiting now to see the response to the governor's halfway offer.
Who are you talking to in the legislature? Talking to leadership,
Yes.
but just not in the governor's office? How are you talking to them?
In every way we can.
Is local government aid part of these conversations?
Local government aid was proposed in the governor's tax bill, and there was a small increase for 1 year in the House File 4 in the conference report. It's an important benefit for local governments and helps reduce the burden on the pressure on property taxes. So it's an important conversation to keep having.
Any other questions?
Representative David says that the legislature's ending of more sales tax in local government provides more money than LGA a year ago. Is that true?
So there is a sales tax exemption for local units of government, including school districts, that's in the bill. It's about $40 million. The governor's original tax bill had significant increases for LGA and CPA. I'll have to get you the specific numbers. When they're fully phased in, I think they were a little more than 40, but I don't think it's a dispute as to whether that is a benefit to local governments. I just think that local government aids continue to be an important source of funding for local governments for essential services.
David says, I think, quote, I provide more money for local governments than he does, meaning David. So can you trade your LGA for his tax cut for local governments?
I think that once we can cross this impasse and get back to talking about the global targets and how we're going to resolve where to spend the remaining surplus to serve Minnesotans, we can certainly have those conversations.
What are the complications of actually putting this together, should you reach an agreement related to time, 4 days left? Where are you with that, and what do you have to do? And can you make it at this point?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, obviously, the legislature has a calendar issue they have to work and manage, and that's certainly up to them. But I think the key is if we can reach an agreement, then I think things can happen quickly. I mean, once you reach an agreement, then you can have things move soon, but we just have to reach an agreement first. It's going to be a tight time schedule, but we'll just have to wait and see.
So does it have to be today? Does it have to, even if you reached it on Friday, Saturday, you could do this? You've had to do this before,
Yes.
so crunching the numbers,
We're ready.
analyzing them.
Yeah, we're ready to go pretty quickly. I think the more difficult thing is just getting it through the legislative process. So I can't speak to that. I mean, they know how much time they need for that. I think we're ready to go on a 24/7 basis to get this done if necessary.
Are you worried about getting it done?
Yes.
Physically, where are you? Where do people sit at this table during negotiations?
They sit right on their, where they sit.
Are the speaker and the governor on opposite ends of this lawn?
No. The leaders sit right at this corner of the table and everybody else down this other way. So the leaders are all kind of on this end.
Republicans are pushing back this idea of the meet halfway budget, saying that meeting halfway isn't cutting the surplus in half, requires looking at where each party started, which is certainly a different philosophical way to look at the definition of meeting in the middle. Can you talk about that, the idea of like splitting the surplus versus meeting in between the starting points?
Well, you can talk about midway if you both start on the same spot. If you're on the playing field, and our position has been all along that our starting points have been a lot different. So we prefer to look at what's available. So the field says right now we have $1.5 billion on this field. And so what we've tried to come up with is a way to equally divide up the $1.5 billion. Admittedly, we took the courts and cybersecurity as a priority, but after that, we divide up the $1.3 $6 billion, and that's how we define meeting halfway.
Anything else?
Is bonding part of the negotiations, or are you gonna put that on until the?
Well, bonding is being discussed with a lot of people. It has not been a big issue at the leadership level right now. I think it's still at the chair level, but it's still being discussed.
You talked about all the uncertainty at the federal level, and certainly all of us have been distracted in recent days by all that's going on.
Has anything been going on outside of St.
Yeah,
Paul?
and I wonder if that is beginning to change the conversations in this room around the projections for the state.
Well, yes, you remember, the forecast, Dr. Klumbakidis was quite clear that the forecast was based upon a tax bill happening this year, tax cuts happening this year at the federal level, and that the federal infrastructure program would get started this year. And so you can tell me more than I know in the last several weeks about where those are and how far along they're going. So we have, that is part of the ambiguity and the uncertainty of a forecast, and that's why I'm always preaching caution when it comes to financial management.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.